Good morning. Today we're here to talk about what will be the first of a two-part presentation, talking about the value and the role of trees, especially within our development process of Orange County. So I'll get this thing to work. So our staff are reviewing our standards and processes for tree preservation and removal for several reasons. The first of which, especially for the last number of years, we have been adding to and amending our sustainability and resilience commitments. And for a longer period of time, our staff have been dealing with issues of implementation of our current codes and having some concerns about the effectiveness of those codes. The third issue, and certainly more recent, is that a number of things are coming up through the commissioner's offices. Folks are concerned about issues relating to mass grading and also tree removal on private property. And I specifically want to thank Commissioner Wilson for giving us the space to do this review and to bring this forward. Obviously, it's a great time to look at best practices. Anytime you're opening up codes, you want to look and see what others are doing, see if there's great models that are out there. And so what we're doing here is bringing a two-part work session to the board. This is still going to be a pretty full discussion here this morning. But two-part discussion, first of which is just education and an awareness of our process, specifically relating to trees. And then the second work session, which tentatively have set for November 30th, is more of that getting into the red meat, looking at the analysis of our codes, looking at what kind of outcomes are coming out of our codes versus what the ordinances are stating as their intended purpose, and then talking about those objectives. What do we want to do moving forward? So this is a basic outline of today's presentation. We're going to talk about the background of our tree codes, discuss those roles and benefits of trees, talk about the current state of our canopy. We've got some studies that I'll show a few examples, and then, as I said before, that awareness of our development review process. The work session 2, I've got a slide at the end that's more comprehensive than this, but I'll go through that when we get to the end. So just looking at the two ordinances that Orange County has had specifically relating to trees, the first was in 1985, regulated the unincorporated areas. It said the things that you should about that trees are essential for health and well-being. It also stated that removal should be controlled, and where possible there should be preservation on site. It regulated trees down to 3 inches in size and did identify the significance of larger trees greater than 24 inches and set some standards for single family and duplexes. So then in 2001, through a rulemaking process, we have our current ordinance, which resides in Chapter 15, Tree Protection and Removal. And I'll just give you some discussion on the impetus for that change. So there had been some information that had come through commissioners' offices relating to community concerns about lots just being clear-cut, corner to corner, and prepped for sale. Sign goes up on it. And that ushered in the concept of protection zones. And you'll see those later in my presentation. But with the intent for that not to, let's say, totally clear a site when you're just making those preparations for development. So our ordinance is administered by the zoning division, and we have 3 long-time, very experienced arborists working on these issues, and they work in collaboration with several different departments within that development process of building and planning, to the DRC office, our environmental folks, and with development engineering. So let's talk a little bit about the role and benefits of trees in Orange County. So why trees are important? Well, at the highest level, they provide ecosystem services, and those are those benefits that we receive, direct and indirect, from our environment, and especially from a healthy environment. And they label those as provisioning and regulating cultural and supporting services. And in the next few slides, I'm kind of bringing that down to some terms that everyone is familiar with. And some of those, just those ecological aspects. Trees provide habitat for animal and other bird species, things like that. They also provide habitat for us because we build our homes, with wood. They provide food sources. They produce oxygen. They're part of the pollination system, which is very critical in this company now, or in this country. One thing about their pollination system is some folks suffer, greatly from allergies. I heard it in the audience. Thank you. my shout out there, allergies. Soil development is another critical issue, and soil stabilization, and you'll see some standards for that on the next slide. So I did find an interesting IFAS study that looked at the 29 census-designated areas in Florida, and what it did was quantify the value of our urban forests in essence, pollution control and management, which as a local government we are critically responsible for. So when you look at air pollution removal, stormwater mitigation, carbon sequestration, you can see significant value that we receive, 600,000 tons annually of air pollutant removal, 50 billion gallons of stormwater reduced, and 65 million tons of CO2 sequestration per year. That's just our forests in Florida. So they have a value. Then you hit the community quality of life issues. These are the things that we are familiar with in our world. They obviously increase our property value. They're responsible for a number of health outcomes from just physiological on through. Noise reduction, traffic calming, consumer spending. One of our colleagues in South Carolina did a study talking about people spend more when they're in commercial areas where there are trees. They stay longer. They frequent those areas more. And then shading the public realm. There's probably 10 bullets you could put below that, just from heat island mitigation to ease on the eyes. But everybody knows that difference in Florida when you are out in the sun and then when you walk under the trees. That's the most obvious issue. So I have two slides in here talking about urban forest management, and this is something that goes back to our sustainability plan from 2014, which talks about the county investing in and having that concept of urban forest management. So that's that integrated concept is the art and the science and technology of managing trees and those forest resources in and around community ecosystems for all of those things that we just discussed on the previous slides. So I looked around at different definitions, and IFAS again had an excellent description of what is an urban forest. So that's that collection of trees and other woody vegetation found in and around human developments. That urban forest is thought of as the gradient of trees extending from the street trees that you see right outside our building in our densely packed urban areas, past the landscape of our suburban plots, all the way out to those remnant forests of the ex-urban or edges of our urban lands. And all of that woody vegetation found within the urban parks, industrial landscapes, residential properties, nature preserves, regardless of ownership. So it's certainly not a stretch to think that the majority of Orange County can be considered or be thought of as having an urban forest. Let me get my clicker to work here. There we go. Okay, so we have some studies that have been done in the last few years. Typically, studies of our canopy have two facets to them. The first is a canopy cover evaluation, and that's where through some aerial analysis you can estimate the amount of canopy coverage over a specified area, whether it be the whole county or the urban service area or a city boundary. And there's multiple methodologies for doing those. You'll see different numbers using different methodologies. It's probably the most important thing is to find a methodology that you're happy with and stick with it, so you see consistency. The second is tree inventory, and that's really where the boots hit the ground. You're going onto properties, you're typing out trees, you're looking to see how well they're surviving. Do they have any disease issues? Are they being impacted by other, buildings in the area? Are they clustered? You're getting that ground truthing data. So we've had, as I said, I'm going to give you an example of each of these two. If I can get this to move forward. There we go. So our county GIS team has done some analysis first in 2009 and then in 2020. They actually did a 2015, but they used a different data set, so I just put those two up here. But that's that false color infrared data using our GIS. The first data layer in 2009 came from DOT, and the second data layer came from the property appraiser's office. Now you got some interesting facets about those layers. You got to make sure you understand when they're taken at what time of year, because certain things look different at different times of year. We have LiDAR data available for 2020, but it was just too big of a computer run to fit through. So our staff are working on some imagery analysis coming soon, some new tools, and they're testing them now. So hopefully moving forward we'll have some interesting data to look at. So putting the 2020 data on a single slide, when you look at the canopy coverage analysis, you see the entire county at about 37.5%. Urban service area, very predictably, dips down a little bit. Obviously, there's more development going on in that area. And then rural and unincorporated came out as the same number. Now, a lot of those lands are the same land, but we may run that one again just to see if that was an anomaly or if that's the number. They're pretty confident with it. And then we ran the cities. You see there along the side, the city's average is about 31.5%, and you see that probably the low there is Belle Isle at 17.5, and Bay Lake is a little higher at 53. I remember when in 2004, when all the hurricanes went through, I spent about 3 weeks chainsawing in Belle Isle. We lost a lot of trees in that area. So now we're looking at that boots on the ground study. So the Legacy Arborist Services in 2016 and finishing up in 2017 focused on the unincorporated urban service area. So within the urban service area outside the cities, and looked at that vegetative structure and its value. So they have about 280 systematically random sample plots, and over maybe a dozen or so, 10 to 12 different land uses. You'll see a picture of it on the next slide. But they collected all that data that I just talked about, specific species, what's the size, how wide is that crown width, is it being impacted by other things around, just how well is it living on that site. So some of the top information, it's a pretty comprehensive study, but I'll just give you some here where it talks about the general assessment. So we've got about 14.65 million trees within our USA outside the cities. Species diversity is about 94 different species. The average tree density of 88 per acre, that's undeveloped lots. That's not obviously developed lots. Size of the trees initially was kind of surprising to me, at 70% of them being fairly small or young trees, assuming that they're young. Some trees don't get bigger necessarily as they get older, but you got a fairly young crop of trees there, 70% at less than 6 inches. About half native species, and then a fairly good portion of healthy trees. 63% is excellent and good lumped together. Then you see the other two gradients. The middle depiction there, I don't know how hard it is for you to see or how easy. It says number of species, and so the most species diversity you see in residential areas, and I think in institutional, I think is the next one down there. And then along the bottom shows that sort of that population curve, the population dynamics of the sizes of trees. And I don't think this is out of the ordinary. I think you'll see a similar type of graph for most areas. But what it does is identify that there are much fewer large trees. Okay, so when you look at trees that are maybe 16 inches and above, that probably doesn't total out to be more than about 5 or 6% there when you add all those together. So there's some value specific to larger trees. So we wanted to try to look nationally to see how, we've got these numbers, is there a way to compare us? The one thing we found was a fairly recent study by AmericanForest.org. They're the oldest nonprofit conservation organization out there, and they had done an analysis of urban forests. So that was really great to have. And some of the points are listed there, that urban areas occupy about 3.6% of our land area in the country, and that their average coverage was about 39.4. So right about where we are. They are, the report is obviously, as you see it listed there, are talking about climate change and also the issues of development as it moves forward. They're concerned that number would dip down to about 32% by 2060. And so they had some recommendations in there for sustaining tree cover and sort of a clarion call for the country to plant about 23 million trees annually. And I think that they kind of brought that down to a single property, and an example is saying it's like 1 tree on a residential property every 11 years or something, how they calculated that down. They did say that in order to fight the effects of future climate change, they had a desire to get up to 43.3%, which is about a 10% over that sustained level. So it was an interesting study. So just trying to land this plane before we get into the development review phase. Canopy coverage showed us at about 37 to 39%, depending on what specific area we're looking at, with 31 for the cities. Our canopy assessment, at least within our urban service area, showed good health and diversity. a high percentage of young trees, obviously a high value of services that those are providing, but a small percentage of mature trees. And when I say mature, I mean we're talking those 24 inches, and above, larger trees. So jumping into the development review process, starting at the comprehensive plan. The comprehensive plan is pretty bullish on protection of our natural resources, specifically calling out the tree protection ordinance, saying that those high quality trees should receive greater protection through the development review process, require preservation of valuable tree species, prohibit indiscriminate clearing, and require those replacements and maintenance for when removal is unavoidable. So the regulating codes that we're talking about here today, the main code obviously is in Chapter 15, Tree Protection and Removal, and then you see the other related codes of 16, 24, 30, 34, and 38, and we'll talk a little bit about them in just a little bit. So in Chapter 15, that highest order where you talk about the findings of fact and purpose, largely repeats what was in the comprehensive plan, that desire to preserve and protect trees for those many benefits that they provide and the overall value to our county. The second issue there is it pretty much took the comprehensive plan and pasted it right into the specific code. So I've got about 5 slides that will run you through the specific aspects of Chapter 15, the tree protection ordinance, but I want to clarify just 2 terms in case you hear me say them and understand the difference between them, and that is for how we measure trees. And for existing trees, we're using that term DBH, diameter at breast height, and that's a measurement at about 4.5 feet above the ground level. But if we're talking about replacement trees, so what might come in a restoration plan or maybe in a development plan for, requiring trees on residential homes, that's caliper inches, okay? And so that's measured at 6 inches above the ground surface for smaller trees, and if they're above, I think it's 4 inches, then you measure it at about 12 inches. And that's kind of to stay away from some buttressing that might occur at the bottom, that you're getting a true representation of the tree trunk size. So jumping into Chapter 15, there's a permit required for the destruction of protected trees, and protected trees are trees that are on the recommended stock list, so that means not invasive tree species, things like that, but that are located within those identified protection zones. So when you look at my graphic on the side there, you see a typical, rectangular property. The A zone there is what might front the open right-of-way. The B is the side and the back, and then the C zone is the middle, which is generally the area that's going to be developed. And so there you can see that in the A zone, we're only talking about trees that are 8 inches or larger. In B, it's 10 inches or larger. In C, it's 24 inches or larger. So anything that's smaller than that in those areas is not subject to the code, no permit required, and no mitigation required, which in some cases can be a significant amount of trees. It requires on-site replacement or payment to the tree fund if you're not going to replace on-site. Sets that dollar amount per caliper inch at 106, and I think that I'd asked whether that had been revised in the last 20 years. I think it may have gone up $3 or something like that. I'm not sure when it happened, but just a small revision. That might have been a year that we had a 3%, across the board increase. There is an increased value provided for specimen trees, and those are live oaks or magnolias that are 24 inches or greater. Now, the ordinance does provide a mitigation cap of 90 caliper inches per acre. And you can see it maxes out at about 9,540. And the intent of that, even though it's not that clear in the ordinance, was for that to be undeveloped properties, not looking in redevelopment circumstances. But that's something that certainly in the second work session we'll be talking about. So there are exemptions, a number of them in the tree protection ordinance. There's exemptions for public road rights-of-way and utility rights-of-way, for access roads into the property through that Zone A. Any tree that's less than 8 inches DBH or any size pine tree, no matter what size or where it is, they are exempt in our code. And some obvious things for bona fide agricultural areas and for commercial nursery stock. If you're growing trees, you don't need to get a permit and pay for trees. Deteriorated or damaged trees, that's largely covered in a state exemption. And then those trees on private lots, so residential properties where the residence is occupied, 2 acres or less. The ordinance does have, as typical, where it will say that if you've already got your permit before this ordinance, you don't need to, you're not subject to the new ordinance, and that developments with a valid PSP development prior to the ordinance. But there are some issues that our staff have with that, and we can address that in our second work session. So there are provisions for deviation from the code and variances and appeals. Those appeals go to DRC, then to the board. And there are enforcement provisions which have replacement requirements for trees, as I've mentioned earlier. We can hold the CO until compliance is achieved. If we don't, obviously we have the CEB process there. So one of the few criteria that's in the ordinance that you might have to justify something is for specimen trees. So those live oaks and magnolias over 24 inches. You've got to say that they're coming out or being impacted because of grading and drainage requirements, or construction of a building, access to the property, or to access to proposed structures, or for parking lot requirements. And that's a pretty broad description of almost everything that goes on a property. So when you get down to mitigation, so on-site mitigation, they have the 1-to-1 or 2-to-1 ratios depending on if it's just a protected tree or if it's a specimen tree. There is standard for replacements at that Florida Nursery Standard 1 or better, and there's only one grade better than that. If no on-site replacement is proposed, you can pay to the tree replacement trust fund. And you can see there that those three allotments for how that money can be spent either on public sites or community enhancement projects. And usually you see that with our IFAS, our tree giveaway programs, where they give away a couple thousand trees each year. It kind of fluctuates, depending on the year. And then our county streetscape program, I think we had about $3.7 million allocated to that program, and they're about 2/3 of the way through that money. I think they've done, I think they're looking for 90 miles, so I think they're about 50 or 60 miles into that program. And then, of course, also an allotment for equipment and materials. So at the end of the ordinance, it talks about residential lot trees. So this is a requirement countywide for residential lots, and it tells you how many trees you have to plant on that lot depending on the size. So it's 1 to 6 trees. They have to be installed prior to CO, and they have to be of a certain size, minimum 8 feet in height, 2-inch caliper. Now, to count towards on-site replacement, and you'll see this in my example coming up, the trees must be 10 inches in height and 3 inches in caliber, so a little bit more robust tree size. So the other ordinance, we're not going to go into these in depth here today, but the issue of mass grading is authorized under Chapter 16. You have commercial landscaping requirements in 24, and then for the process standards and then the subdivision standards are in 30 and 34. And there are some unique landscaping standards specific to Horizon West in Chapter 38. So this is a view, and this kind of came from a presentation that we gave a couple years ago of our development process to try to give you a sense of where those tree impacts are considered. So right now it's at the PSP DP phase or with construction plans and site plans. So where are those, or in essence, what are those tree impacts reviewed in? Those are those PSPs, mass grading permits, which go through DRC and then ultimately to the board. Development plans, commercial development plans, or mass grading DPs that go through DRC and they're managed there, and then construction plans, which are in essence negotiated by staff. So I'm going to take you through two examples here of a residential site and a commercial site. Now, both of these sites have used that 90 caliper inch per acre, and really I'm taking these, taking you through these to show you how our staff do the accounting. You know, how they, when they look at these applications, how are they managing that accounting process of the ultimately for the replacement mitigation requirements. So this first is Harrow Oaks PD. It's about 17 acres, just north of 50. You see the little econ, canal there. It actually has two sections. There's a road that bisects the top third there. A fair amount of trees on the property, 63 single-family homes. So when staff get this, there's a site plan, and that site plan gives you, an understanding of where the lots are, where the roads are, stormwater, and you'll also see an overlay of the tree survey on top of that site plan. So just blowing it up a little bit, we're looking at the top portion here, you can see those tree protection zones. So you see the zone A, there's actually two zone A's because of that little middle road that cuts through. You've got zone B and zone C, and I've circled 3 X's there, and X's meaning these are trees that are coming out. Now if you saw a dot with a circle around it, that's a tree that is going to remain. There aren't any in that top section, but I'll show you I'll show you an example of where they are. There we go. In the bottom section, it's pretty faint, but I just circled some of the areas where they're remaining, but you can see the majority of everything on that property is coming out. There's a lot of X's up there. So I've got some, okay, this is the accounting of each tree is specifically laid out on these plans. And so you see the circle on the left there has a number 4 next to it, and that will correspond to a table which will tell you that that number 4 is a live oak that's 17 inches. And it also will tell you what the mitigation requirement for that 4 is 17 inches. Now if it was 24 or above, it would be more than that because it's a 2-to-1 ratio. But that's how that accounting works. So I've got some, animations in here, so I'm going to see if I can make it work. So what they're doing is they're going to calculate the total number of impacts in zone A, B, C, and D. And here in this, it's 8,714 inches. Then they're proposing that the total protected inches to be removed is 8,233. They're preserving 481 inches, which leaves them with the replacement requirement for 7,752. Now, because they're using the 90 caliper inch per acre cap, that brings that 7,752 down to 1,484, and that's that acreage times 90 inches. So by the time that you remove 481 preserved inches, that brings you down to about 1,000. And then you remember before I talked about the ability to bring in those lot trees that they're going to, so they have 564 inches from the lot trees, and then the common area trees 440, which effectively zeroes out this particular application. So that's one example. The second is an industrial site. So this is out on Land Street Road, I-2, I-3 site that's to be used for concrete storage. You can see that site was fully vegetated. Then, now they didn't submit a tree survey because they said, we're going to use the 90-inch exemption for this, because so we don't necessarily need to type out where the trees are. They did keep a few along the buffer on the west side there, and they negotiated that with staff. So you see those 266 inches preserved on site, which brought them down, in this particular case, just an easy equation of 2,460 times that 106. So they paid $260,760 to the tree fund on that site. So there's 2 different types of scenarios there. Obviously, there's lots of different scenarios out there. We just picked these 2 to run you to see how that accounting is done. Okay, one where you didn't pay and one where you did. So then where these tree impacts are actually permitted for removal is during that mass grading permit, at construction plans, if there's an infrastructure PSP or grading and drainage PSP, now those are authorized under Chapter 34, or a mass grading DP, which is basically authorized under Chapter 38. So this is where those mass grading reviews take place, either just before the PSP stage or just before construction plan. So real quick, jumping into Chapter 16, mass grading is the movement of earth entirely within the boundary of a project after the PSP approval, but prior to approval of construction drawings. And the ordinance says that those permits go to the board. Now, a great many projects qualify for exemptions. The specific exemption there is excavating, grading, filling, and removing of earth in conjunction with commercial or subdivision construction, provided construction approval or permit, a B permit, a building permit, has been obtained, and that the amount of material that you're bringing in or moving around doesn't exceed 200 cubic yards. So that's why a lot of projects don't necessarily come to the board, because they have this exemption. Now here's some other examples of mass grading permits and their unique processes. So infrastructure PSPs or grading and drainage PSPs might create a pond parcel or a parcel for future development. Now, they go out through all the DRC reviewers. If the PSP gets approved by the board, that subsequent mass grading plan does not come back through the board because it already had its day. The tree plan was reviewed there. Now, mass grading DPs, which are largely authorized under Chapter 38. You give some examples of what DPs authorize in the county. But those mass grading DPs happen earlier in the process. And they're submitted for DRC review. They get their arbor review. But because they're prior to the PSP stage, there's not a very detailed site plan associated with those reviews. And so you might not have a full understanding of where lots are going to be or specific structures, and so it's more difficult for staff to say, why are these trees coming out? Because I don't see something there. It might be open space. You never know what eventually it will be. If approved by DRC, those mass grading permits are approved administratively. So summarize that process. Tree impacts are evaluated at that PSP DP mass grading and construction plan review. Those mass grading DPs may occur prior to that detailed site plan review. Tree impacts are permitted through that tree removal permit for Chapter 15, following action either by the board or DRC or staff, depending on the development type. And many mass grading projects qualify for those exemptions, that exemption under Chapter 16. However, those tree reviews, oops, bumped it. Those tree reviews still occur at the staff level. So that upcoming agenda for work session number 2, there obviously will be a recap of session 1, but this is where we really start to jump in and show some examples of the codes. So we'll talk about those intent and purpose versus the outcomes. We'll see, what types of projects we're permitting. Talk about the issues that our staff has, whether it's in public works or in zoning or others. Talk about process and design challenges, whether you're talking about limitations for stormwater or the depth of utility pipes. There's any number of scenarios out there that cause issues with trees and how our staff either can or can't manage that. We'll talk about the current fee, as I mentioned, that mitigation fee, just to see if that seems like it's still in line. And then have a full discussion of those stakeholders. There's a lot of stakeholders in this. I dipped in real quick to our Environmental Protection Commission, kind of let them know we were starting this process. I talked to our Sustainability Advisory Board, and you saw the Vice Chair come up here. I was very interested to see that. Told them a little bit about, and really what I wanted them to tell me was if there was anything for them to say, hey, make sure you look at this. When you're doing this review, make sure you look at this. And I was on a vacation last month at the time, but I'll jump in with the Ag Advisory Board on the 3rd, so next week. They meet at the beginning of the month because they're of interest, because when you start talking about species diversity, obviously you've got to get these species from somewhere. And I want to talk to them and maybe even the Farm Bureau about where these tree stocks come from and are there any limitations out there. So then we'll look at other jurisdictions. As we mentioned, that's a pretty familiar process to you when you see ordinances come through. And then start to talk to the board about those priorities. Now, I didn't put the sustainability and resilience commitments in this presentation because you can see I'm already long. And so we'll touch on those just before as we start talking about those board priorities. And then if there are any options, whether it's immediate actions or short-term, mid-term, long-term things that we can see that we want to talk about, we'll lay those out. Obviously, the challenges you'll be well aware of by that point. And then talk about the board's process to see what the board wants to see, throughout either across the board for projects or if it's variances or waivers and different justifications. Obviously, we'll lay out our process from that point, which will enter a more formal rulemaking process where we engage our stakeholders and move forward. So that is my very long presentation. Thank you. And I have a great team. A lot of them are here. We've got folks from our zoning division and public works, here, environmental protection, and our planning division. So we've got a good group of folks, and also, oops, I'm sorry, I keep bumping into that, for Kevin Cam at our IPAS office. And so we've got a good wealth of knowledge in our staff. Thank you, Mayor.
All right, very comprehensive. We have a few questions. Commissioner Wilson.
Yeah. I just want to say thank you so much. I know that I have been a horrible thorn in everyone's side on this issue, but I also know that everyone has been so great about turning right around and saying, let's dig in, let's figure it out. Chris Essman right away was like, this does need to be updated. And John said, we eventually saw these pieces to come together. I think Jeff Benavides, very early on in my conversations with him, said there's, just things that need to be updated that may not be as difficult as some of these things. So seeing this presentation and understanding those layers and understanding that there are going to be some things that will be easier to fix administratively and some things that we really just need to dig in on. I just really appreciate the amount of work and time that you've put into this, Mr. Marshall, and to anybody and everybody out there that's worked on this, because I know it's very complex. And I also know that there are so many moving parts when there's a development plan that comes forward. I think just for the board's sake, can we talk about when we look at the measurements of a tree, and you talk about a mature tree, exactly how many years is that? What is that? Is there, some a way to describe that in human year terms?
Well, it probably will depend on the species of tree. Some of them are going to grow more quickly than others. I'll try to give you some of that when I come back, but I would say that I can only take the example of the trees that I planted. I planted 10 trees on my little quarter acre in Altamont, and my live oaks and magnolias, because those are the two types that I planted mostly, in about 15 years got to about that big. So you're looking at about 18 inches there. So I would say upwards of 20 years for the first 20 inches, but that's just a guess, based on what I'm seeing, on my property. But we'll bring some of that back for you and give you an understanding of that time frame. I thought what was interesting was the lifespans of a lot of these trees. When, for live oaks, if you've got a tree that's 100 years old, it's right in the middle of its life.
Right.
And you heard someone speaking this morning about how functionally viable they are at that point. That's when they have the most muscles, as far as those services that they provide.
And I happened to be on a sustainability panel a few weeks ago where a scientist was talking about some of the developments in carbon sequestration. And, this was a very in-depth technical discussion. But at the end of the discussion, the bottom line was the best tool we have in carbon sequestration is trees. And so, it was very interesting because I really got into the weeds about the ideas out there in carbon sequestration. At the end of the day, God figured it out. And so I just, I feel like looking at what our investments are in trying to make our community more sustainable and our sustainability goals moving forward and climate challenges, and seeing the value in these trees. Once again, we talk about the beauty, we talk about the ecological benefit, but ultimately it's, life-saving on a larger scale in carbon sequestration. So thank you so much for your good work.